The ghost in the gap-toothed smile. He hadn't meant to idealize her, to construct a shrine in his mind and place her gently upon it. He hadn't meant to overwhelm, yet the intensity of his focus felt like a palpable weight, a suffocating blanket woven from unspent admiration. She was radiant, yes, but not in a manufactured, influencer way. She simply glowed with uncomplicated engagement. At the language exchange meeting, she moved through the scattered tables like a benevolent conductor, effortlessly drawing people in. She shook hands with genuine force, pulled up mismatched chairs, and always scooted over to make room for the latecomers. "Are you the organizer?" a nervous newcomer had asked, clutching a French dictionary like a shield. "No," she'd replied, her voice warm and low. "Just a woman with a smile." A woman in a simple, buttercup yellow sundress, whose presence alone seemed to smooth the rough edges of the awkward gathering. What was her name again? Nora. And then she directed that astonishing, focused smile at him, that pure, undiluted warmth. Her questions were simple, yet they felt weighted with profound importance. Matteo stirred uncomfortably in his hard wooden seat, gripping the chilled neck of his beer bottle so tightly his knuckles were white. He did that sometimes, or rather, the nerves did. They were an entity of their own, coiling in his chest, making his hands tremor like a tuning fork. "What does your tattoo mean?" she asked, leaning in across the table. Her gaze was direct, fixed on the faint black outline of ink on his forearm. Both hands were braced on the edge of the table, anchoring her curiosity, giving her posture a juvenile energy, something endearingly young and open, amplified by her slight, gap-toothed smile. "I drew it," Matteo managed, his voice a little thicker than he liked. It was a simple illustration, a stylized, half-defined ghost. He'd scribbled it in his notebook the day his dad had completely ignored his new shoes, expensive leather Oxfords. He'd traded in his scruffy Vans and their worn tongues because he thought real men, not boys, wore real shoes. The ghost was the perfect symbol for his resulting sense of erasure. "Really?" Nora said, her eyes wide, the light catching the tiny green flecks in her irises. "That's so cool, but what does it mean to you?" It was the most cliché question a person could ask about a tattoo, but the fact that she asked it made it feel profound. "I think I felt invisible," he admitted, shrugging slightly, trying to project a casual distance he didn't feel. "What does that feel like?" she countered, tilting her head.
Right. How would a person who is so manifestly seen, so inherently luminous, ever know what invisibility felt like? And how could he know that she was anything more than a bubbly personality, a pretty face, and an endless stream of earnest questions? The granularity of imperfection. Do you listen to everything others say, or do you stare through them, seeing only what isn't there? Matthew struggled with the former. 2 days later, they sat in a small, bustling cafe near the university. The worn, cracked leather seats smelled faintly of old espresso and rain, and pamphlets advertising local concerts were scattered across the peeling windowsill. Matthew stuttered, the nerves from the first meeting having migrated from his hands to his vocal cords. He tried to speak about his job, his reason for being in Lille, but the words came out in hesitant bursts, like a bad engine trying to turn over. Had she noticed the tremor running through him? Her eyes dropped, not to his face, but to his hands, which were now visibly jittery as he picked obsessively at a folded sugar sachet. His whole body felt like the crown of a thin, stressed tree, his voice rustling as lightly and incoherently as dry leaves. He felt terribly, painfully visible beneath her unwavering gaze. "So, what brings you to Lille?" he asked, trying to fill the sudden, suffocating silence. He was desperate to pivot the scrutiny back to her. He watched as her lips moved in response, how a smile flitted here, then there, then disappeared into a contemplative line. Her eyes crinkled only at the edges when she paused to consider her words. They were a complicated, beautiful brown-green, hazel, perhaps. He noticed the tiny dusting of new freckles sprinkled across her cheeks from the sun. He zoomed in further, a bit of dead skin on the bridge of her nose, peeling almost imperceptibly like dry glue. The fine, untrimmed hairs above her upper lip. It was a lip that was plump and pink and soft, he bet, but imperfect. She was far from the perfect, pedestal-ready creation his mind had begun to assemble. She was an ordinary individual with ordinary flaws, ordinary ideas, maybe even mediocre ones. A regular person. He wouldn't idealize her, not this time. He was older, wiser, aware of his patterns. She'd do, just like this, just as she was. And hadn't he grown, knowing he could still feel attracted without the exhausting, destructive urge to worship? "What about you?" she asked, her head tilted again. "What about me?" "Pourquoi es-tu venu à Lille?" Her voice changed subtly when she spoke French. It regressed, losing the careful modulation of English, becoming higher, douce, the voice of an always curious, always inquiring girl. And in that moment, he felt the nervous, dangerous urge to burst out laughing, to grab her hand, to kiss her feet in sheer appreciation for her simple existence. He was happy, foolishly, merely to be in her orbit, to sit across from her orange summer dress, watching her doe eyes. She was as pretty as a present with a ribbon tied, but he was no longer one to idealize, remember? Happy, he concluded, was the right word. Ordinary happiness, just like him and just like her. At least that's what he told himself, trying to anchor his soaring feelings to a manageable platonic reality.
"But you don't know me, Matthew," Nora said hours later, her voice muffled slightly as her head rested on a pillow in his sparse studio apartment. "I know," he replied, tracing the line of his tattoo. "I've been reminding myself constantly that you're just another individual too, that you're flawed and human, that I'd have to accept that version of you, not the idea." "It sounds like you've been thinking a lot about me," she observed flatly. "I have." "It sounds like you've been idealizing me, really, and then just trying to mitigate it by obsessively focusing on my flaws," she corrected, her voice taking on a harder edge. "And that's also obsessive. I don't want to be anybody's Limerent object. It's reductive. It's dehumanizing even." She shifted, pulling her arm out from under the duvet, sitting up slightly. "You know, nobody ever sees me," she continued, her gaze suddenly intense. "They project their fantasies, their desire onto me. They see what they want to possess. That guy from the language exchange, Laurent, for example, he's already grabbed my waist multiple times, even though I flinched and pulled away. They feel entitled to my space, my emotion, my body, based on their perception of my smile. I can't just be, ever, it seems." A bolt of defensiveness shot through him. "Well, now you're making me feel guilty for being attracted to you. If my attraction is so problematic, we can absolutely go back to being friends, if it makes you feel better, but I'm not sure I'd be able to manage the shift easily." "Maybe," Nora said, dragging herself fully out of the bed, reaching for her dress. "Coffee?"
The currency of intimacy. "Hi, Matthew. I think we got carried away last night, and I'm feeling a little uncomfortable. Is it okay if we go back to being platonic? If so, are we still on for the fireworks? I would bring my friend along." Nora sent the message, then watched the little bubbles pop up, signifying his immediate, frantic reply. She scrolled and scrolled and scrolled, Page after page of text, an utterly disproportionate, spiraling deluge. You can't tell me how to feel. My feelings are mine, and I care about you now. You initiated intimacy. Don't tell me not to get attached. I don't resent you, but... Page after page. It felt like kissing him was a contract, a binding legal document that now entitled him to her emotional interior. You're afraid of intimacy, but deep down, I think you're open to a romantic connection. It's just that you've been hurt before. You're closed off, sure, but you're just scared. Page after page. Kissing him was now a sentence. He had made her tea and microwave leftovers. He had kissed her while she was drunk and vulnerable, and now she was emotionally responsible for this near stranger? They had met 3 times, the language exchange, coffee, and finally a chance encounter at a bar after her bad date. And now he expected love as though it were a predetermined exchange, a currency he had paid for with his attention, a food stamp for her affection. Starving he was, and he had devoured the thought of her, licking the bones of the idea clean. Matthew, I'm feeling overwhelmed. You've crossed several of my boundaries, and now you're psychoanalyzing me whom you barely know. It's inappropriate and unfair. Maybe I'm afraid of intimacy, sure, but not with you. I simply don't want to be with you, and that's okay. Nora flinched at his instant reply. You should be more considerate about the feelings of those you decide to initiate intimacy with. Hi, Matthew. We don't know each other well enough to be having this kind of conversation or this level of emotional intensity. I won't have it. He blocked her. Minutes later, he unblocked her, sending a fresh message. Sure, I shouldn't have sent you all that at once, but I stand by what I said, and it's none of my business what you're like with other men, regardless of my opinion. And I was dishonest about my emotions yesterday because I felt used, and rightfully so. Just send me your bank details so I can pay you back for the beers you insisted on buying me, despite me expressing my discomfort. But I wish you the best here in Lille.
The smell of violation. We don't own the rights to how we're perceived or imagined by others, but that doesn't mean it isn't deeply violating. What had he done with the thought of her, and why could she feel it? Why was the violation so palpable, so physical? Why could she smell it hanging in the air of her apartment like spoiled milk? Why could she taste the resentment and entitlement in every forkful of instant noodles? She pushed her bowl aside, the cheap metal fork cluttering loudly against the porcelain. She'd lost her appetite. She dry-gagged. Everything tasted, sounded, smelled of him taking liberties with the idea of her, pulling her apart and reassembling her like a Mrs. Potato Head. He was utterly unaware that he was doing it, that he'd reduced her to a plaything and stuck ears where they didn't belong, chose his favorite set of eyes and removed the mouth. Who needs a mouth, anyway, when you're a blank face projected onto? She was rendered arbitrary, just an outline, but she had just enough of an identity, of individuality, to serve as the screen, to personify all his desires and projections, allowing him to genuinely believe that the feelings, the ideas, and the connection were real, that it was her and not just his imagination. The lingering nightmare. Nightmares sometimes linger, their fingerprints loud and luminescent on the waking world. Nora woke with a gasp, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. He'd been in the dream, following her, always just a few steps behind, not threatening but undeniably present. Wide awake now, the darkness felt suddenly charged with potential energy. She rose quickly, the fear a cold knot in her stomach, afraid she'd find him outside her apartment door or in the stairwell, perhaps just staring at the wood, waiting. She crept to the door and fastened the chain lock with a trembling hand, then threw the curtains shut on her third-story windows. She flipped on the kitchen light above the stove, a small, bright beacon meant to dispel the darkness should it dare to morph into a man who'd lived
God knows what, with the fantasy of her. A man who clearly resented her autonomy, her boundaries, her refusal to assume the role he'd cast her in. But what if he was outside somewhere? What if he saw her light come on? Nausea and goosebumps were evoked by a near stranger who had conjured up an entire narrative centered around her and him, a narrative which he seemed to believe despite its complete non-reciprocity. Limerence, she realized, wasn't flattering. It was degrading, reductive, and dehumanizing. He had poured all his expectations and needs into her, as though she were an empty container, a heart-shaped cake pan waiting for batter.
Knock, knock. Mathieu pulled at the heavy apartment building doorknob, but it caught immovably in its frame. Locked. If he could just speak to her in person, the written word was too easily misinterpreted, too easily discarded. The air was cold, a biting autumn wind climbing up his spine and caressing his exposed neck. He sat on the curb across the street, hunched, watching a group of drunken girls stumble down the street. They squealed with laughter, their high heels clinking like dropped ghost stones. One stumbled right across the road and past him. She stopped at the adjacent building entrance, fumbling with her keys, the metal scratching against the keyhole. The door creaked open. He seized the moment. His dirty leather shoe, the Oxfords he'd bought to be a real man, acted as a perfect door jamb. He slipped inside just as the girl disappeared into the dark stairwell. Mathieu followed, passing the ground floor mailboxes until he reached the third-floor landing. He found her door. In Lacombe. He sat down heavily on the cold, unforgiving concrete of the stairwell, right outside her door. He rehearsed his lines, his earnest pleas, the logical arguments for why they belonged together. He rehearsed them in his head. Then softly, aloud. Knock, knock. If he could just speak to her in person. Knock, knock. A little louder this time. Knock, knock.